With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Ches. We will begin on Daf Zayin Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid by the 2 dots, as we had the third and final machlokes in the first Mishnah regarding the mitzvah and the challenge of covering the blood of a chaya, of a non-domesticated animal, covering the blood of a bird, of a fowl, as the Torah gives us such a positive commandment. But when it comes to getting the earth and when it comes to covering this blood, there's a potential violation of charisha, which is digging earth. There's a potential violation of tchina or ketisha, grinding, because when the clods of earth are going to be broken down in order for you to properly fulfill the mitzvah, you're going to potentially and normally violate the av of techina. There's going to be an issue over here of binyan, which is making a hole in the ground, certainly outdoors. And finally, there is a muktzah, rabbinic issue, which is earth, unless it was previously designated for it to be used, is muktzah. Nevertheless, the Gemara will explain why both according to Beis Shammai l'chatchila and according to Beis Hillel b'di'evid, one in the case of the Mishnah will not be violating any of the above. That's going to allow us to review kilkul. It's going to allow us to review malacha she'ein tzricha lagufa. We're going to repeat the machlokes, the very important machlokes, Rashi and Tosfos, how to understand malacha she'ein tzricha lagufa. And finally, we're going to have a little bit on Amid Beis. The concept of an asay is generally doicha eloisase, but that's only when these two are happening be'idna, while you're violating the lav. At that time, you are fulfilling the positive commandment, and we will see how this connects to our sugya. Now, a big part of today's daf will be quoting a Mishnah Masechtas Chulin that speaks about the unique prohibition of covering the dam an Yom Tiv of a koi. Some people pronounce it kvi, we'll pronounce it koi. Koi is some sort of creature, according to our sugya, that is halachically a question whether it is considered a behema, whether it's considered a chaya. If it's a behema, then you're not obligated to cover the blood. If it's a chaya, then you have a mitzvah to cover the blood. Covering the blood on Yom Tov, when there is a doubt, ultimately will lead us into the concept of a tircha sheloi l'tzoyrech, which means that a exertion on Yom Tov, which is not necessary, is prohibited even on Yom Tov. At the end of today's daf, we're going to learn about someone who shechted a bird prior to Yom Tov, and we will see that one is not allowed to cover the blood on Yom Tov if you did not do so previously. So there is an obligation, but not in this case. And at the end, we'll have a machlokes as to what happens if someone made a dough before Yom Tov, whether they are allowed to separate the challah or not. Just for the sake of clarity, even though not normally separating challah, like separating any trumas yemaiseres, is rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, it's considered like tikkun, right, connected to makeh b'patish. But if you make a dough on Yom Tov, which we are allowed to make, certainly you are allowed to separate the challah. Notice this rabbinic prohibition did not go on making dough on Yom Tov. The question will be, if someone made dough before Yom Tov, and they should have separated challah, therefore before Yom Tov, and they didn't, whether they are allowed to separate challah or not is going to be the final machlokes we'll learn today. And without any further ado, Chevra, this is going to be a loaded daf. Daf Zayin Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid by the 2 dots. We clarified the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The Mishnah is speaking about someone who's asking a shayla to a rav, am I allowed to shecht a chaya? Am I allowed to shecht a fowl? And the Beis Shammai says that, yeah, we tell him absolutely. And Beis Hillel says that we tell him not to do so, but if he already did it, then umoidim, they both agree. And here are the words in the Mishnah, she'im shachat, sheyachbor bedeked, that he should dig with a spade, v'yachase, and cover the blood. Now you have to appreciate that sheyachbor bedeked, the Mishnah is hinting to something. Why doesn't the Mishnah just say, cover it? Why is the Mishnah telling you should dig with a spade? That's the key to the insight. Why really, if one would have to violate any Isur Doiraisa, and will put with that muktzah, which is not a Doiraisa, but here we'll view it as a quasi Doiraisa, then one will not be allowed to do so. Not even according to Beis Shammai, who was the lenient opinion over here. Says the Gemara, Amar Rab Zirika, Amar Rab Yehuda. Here we start. Vehu, when is one allowed to do so? lechatchila lebeis Shammai b'diavad lebeis Hillel sheyesh loy deker no'utz mi ba'od yoim, that prior to Yom Tiv, one already had a spade, or today we'll call this a shovel, or any other instrument that digs earth out of the ground. It was already inserted in the ground. What do we accomplish with that? Let me get this important. If you already have the shovel in the ground, you're not violating Charisha. You're not making the furrow was made. Furthermore, Tosfos says, since the spade was in the ground, in order to take earth out, that earth is called Mukhan. It's prepared to be used. It's no longer muktzah. Now we mentioned, correctly so, two other issues. Binyan and grinding, tchina, because if when the earth comes out it's very hard, then you have to farbrekel it in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So the Gemara says, ka'avid ketisha, you're crushing it, you're crushing the clouds of earth. That's another isur do'iraisa. Ketisha is a tulda of tchina, toichen. So Amarav Chia Barashi Amarav Dafches. Again, it must be referring to, and it's only referring to a case. But Afar Tichuach. Afar Tichuach means where the earth is already loose. In other words, there aren't clouds of earth. V'haka Avid Guma. When you are removing the spade, you are leaving a hole, and that is a tulda of binyan. Here answers the Gemara, no, that's not a problem. If a person is digging a hole on Shabbos, but he doesn't need the hole, he's only digging a hole because he needs the earth. So we're not speaking about other issues, we're just focusing on the binyan part, making the whole issue pater aleha. He's exempt. Now we know by Shabbos, pater doesn't mean mutter. Pater means you're not violating a biblical, but you are violating a rabbinical, and we got a problem with that. Why are we allowed to violate a rabbinical? So let's learn Rashi and let's learn Tosfos. No. This is one second. So this is not davar she'ein mischaven. Davar she'ein mischaven is when you are not even wanting to do that. You're dragging a chair, you don't even want to make a furrow. Here you're making a hole. This, let's not jump ahead. Rashi says, pater aleha. Look inside the top Rashi. Interesting. As far as the hole is concerned, you're doing a destructive act, and look inside the second Tosfos. And Tosfos says what most people think. Now Shlomo really said it, but you said the wrong words, but you said the right concept. This should l'chayra be a typical, a classical melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. You're doing a melacha, you're making a hole. In the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan, they would make a hole because they needed a hole. And that's Tosfos' definition of melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. Was if you make a hole because you need a hole, so you're doing it with the same intent as it was done in the Mishkan, that's a melacha she'tzricha legufa. Here you don't need a hole, you only need the earth, that's a melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. Now Chavra, let's quickly chazer. If our Gemara would follow Rabbi Yehuda holds melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is chayiv. Must be, take it the way we paskin. Melacha she'ein tzricha legufa is like Rab Shimon pater. And that's what Tosfos learns. Frek Tosfos v'chitei mit dem kein pater avalasa lechatchila. That's key. V'yashloimar the mishum simchas yom tiv mutar afilo lechatchila. Okay, and here's what we spoke out before. Why, if now that it's a melacha she'ein tzricha legufa, so that should resolve charisha. If that resolves charisha, asks Tosfos, why do we have to say that deker is na'utz? Right, it's already resolved with melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. Tosfos says, because we also need to address muktzah. And it's amazing that according to Tosfos, simchas yom tiv overrides rabbinic rule. So pater aval aser, but it would not override muktzah. It's here you see again that sometimes muktzah is viewed mamish like a quasi d'oraisa. Problem is, why doesn't Rashi learn like Tosfos? This is so simple that when you dig a hole and ein tzarech ela la'afra, why will this not be a melacha she'ein tzricha legufa? Why does Rashi have to bring in kilkel? So Chavra, we learned this in Shabbos a few times. Le Rashi the definition of melacha she'eina tzaricha legufa is only when you're doing something, let's say, for a preventative nature. For example, remember we learned if a person kills a snake, for them not to be killed by the snake, for them not to be bitten by the snake. That's called I'm doing something to prevent something from bad. Or there was a mace in the house, there's a bad odor, you are removing the mace. You are removing the mace not because you want the mace outdoors, because you don't want the bad odor indoors. That's the way Rashi defines a melacha she'eina tzaricha legufa. Here, you're digging a hole, it's not of a preventative nature. Here you want the offer. LeRashi, that's not called melacha she'eina tzaricha legufa. So therefore he must explain that what's happening over here, the heter here is the heter of kilkul. Okay.
Simcha means basar?
Simcha means having basar. Very good. Otazai. Let's not forget about the wine, but we're focusing on the basar. Yeah. Okay. Then, if you remember, the flow of the Mishnah mamish didn't go. No, it's the last line of the Mishnah on Daf Beis, noch metashin, since she'efer kira, which means ashes that's in an oven, ashes in a stove, which are ashes that came about after the wood, which is the fuel, mamish, got burnt, it becomes ashes, it's considered muchan. Who's talking about ashes in a kira? Fakert, the Mishnah spoke about yachbar bedeker v'yachasa. So it says in the last words in the Mishnah, she'efer kira, ashes of a stove are considered already prepared for Yom Tiv. It says think about it, efer kira man dachar shmei. Who is mentioning anything about such ashes? Amar Abba, you must exchange the letter shin for a letter vav. He's not that he's mamish making an emendation, but normally, especially by a Mishnah, it says shin. It means ve'efer kira muchanu. There's another din that the Mishnah is saying. Another din that if a person wants to shecht and they don't have this yachbar bedeker, they don't have the spade stuck in the ground, or even if they have it, they don't need to use it. If they have ashes that's in an oven, those ashes are good to fulfill the mitzvah of kisei dam ba'afar. You're not doing charisha, they're in the oven. You're not doing binyan, right? You're not going to do katisha because there's no clods in the ashes, and it's not muksa. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, hold on. For the ashes not to be muksa, leishanu elo shehusak mi be'erev yontiv. Yeah, if the ashes were created from fuel, from wood that was already burnt from before Yom Tiv, that is where you can say it's not muktzah because it was already be'en. The ashes were here, and people designate the ashes to be used for what it's needed for. One of the things you could use ashes for is to cover dam for the mitzvah of kisei dam ba'afar. Chavra, I said correctly yesterday, we learned this in Chulin. What is valid to do the mitzvah of covering the blood? Something that is able to have anything sprout in it. And I want you to know that there's a difference between ashes, Tosfos writes over the third Tosfos, ashes from food, nothing will grow in it. Wood that burns, that becomes ashes, epis can grow out of it. So taka, it's valid for the mitzvah of kisei dam ba'afar. So let's go weiter. This is only good if the ashes were here. But if you have wood that became ashes on Yom Tov, which is 100% okay, you're making food on Yom Tov. There, Chevra, don't forget that since when Yom Tov came in, the wood was designated for fuel. You didn't have ashes yet. So now it's muktzah, asur. Muktzah, some people say it's in the category of noilad, like it was not even here in the world before.
So how do we use sawdust on Erev Kippur?
You know, wood, fakert, you just substantiated what Tosfos says. So anything that it's a wood derivative, tzamach, even ashes, for sure, wood itself, there are certain, tzamachim doesn't mean you can plant a apple tree. It means that if it will sit enough time in the mikveh, there'll be some green stuff coming out of it.
Yeah, ashes things can grow from. Sawdust is wood, but nothing grows from.
Tzamachim doesn't mean a proper fruit tree. I think something will come out of it. You Google it, we'll find out. But that's taka what we use today. Okay, now another detail. What happens if the ashes were created on Yom Tiv, but they're so hot still? How hot that an egg, remember the chicken egg is the easiest thing to fry or to roast. If you can fry on it an egg, you know what it means? It means wood was designated to be used for fuel. These ashes are still considered fuel. They're not something new. They are a remnant of the old, they can still be used for the same purpose of the old, Gavaldik. So even though its form changed, but its designation, the wood was for fuel, this is still fuel. So then it's not muksa. And since it's not muksa, yes, it's kosher for kisei adam, b'diuk. Yes, that's exactly what the Mishnah is saying, mutter. And Tanya nami hachi, that kesha amru efer kira muchanu, a braisa, that muchanu means it's not muksa. And yes, shleima, that's what Tosfos says, the third Tosfos, that it's therefore kosher also for kisei adam. It doesn't only mean for kisei adam. It means it's not muksa, you can use it for other purposes. Lo yamru ella shusik merav yantiv. That's only if the ashes were be'en from before yantiv. Aval husik be'yantiv. So then we would view the ashes as muktzah / noilot, according to many rishonim. But ve'imroi litzleit by Beitzah. But if it's still hot enough, it's burning hot, and therefore you can roast an egg. Ubemela, you still view this. It's still in a state where its original designated state can be fulfilled. So then, mutter, weiter in the Beitzah. This is very important. This is going to be a little bit about what type of earth is muktzah and what earth is not. Like kids can play in a, in a sandbox on Shabbos and Yom Tov. They could, because the sand was placed there for kids to play in it. It's any earth that was designated for a purpose is no longer muktzah as long as it happened from before. So here will be the Beitzah. If someone brought in a large pile of earth, he brought it in his domain because he wants to use it later. He didn't have to bring it in for kisei adam. It's a lot of earth. He has a garden, he has a churva, whatever. He needs to have earth to lay down a new floor in the churva. In other words, he's going to be using it for something. It's already not muktzah. Smuchan. Now, if you shecht on Yom Tov, you can use from that earth. Or you don't need for the earth to be designated for kisei adam. You only need for this earth not to be muktzah. Muta lachasas boy. Now, the Beitzah is speaking about hichnis offer. It means a large amount of earth. A large pile of earth will not be bottle when you put it on the ground. Don't forget the ground then was also earth, because it was a large pile. What happens if a person has a little amount of earth? There would be a havamina to say that's already bottled to the ground. So is machadash Amar Rav Yehuda that machnis adam even only meloi kupasei offer. A person is allowed to bring into his house the amount of a basketful, and also to be used for whatever purpose. There's a chiddush here. He's not repeating what it says in the Beitzah. The Beitzah is speaking about a large amount. He's speaking about of any amount. And now that he brought it into his house before Yom Tov for a purpose, you can use it for whatever you need on Yom Tov. It's no longer muktzah, including for kisei adam. Now, Dorash Marzutra Mishmeider Marzutra Rabam. When you're speaking about a small amount of earth, you have to clarify Sheyichad Loi Keren Zavius, that you put it in a particular spot. He's saying something very important. The Holy Baal Shem Tov, we know one of the things that he did before he revealed himself is to make parnasa, he would put earthen floors down. If a person puts a small amount of earth on their floor, if they didn't designate it a place, which means they didn't pile it, but they laid it out in a very thin layer, that's pshat, that they laid it there for a floor. And once you laid it for the floor, even though you can have the right to choose later and use it for something else, you're the balabas, but not on Yom Tov, because prior to Yom Tov, it was already placed there to stay there. It has to be clear that when you're meyachad, it's not just about that you designated the corner. It means it's in a pile. That earth is to be used. Then I say, even though it's a small amount, it's not going to be bottled to the ground. Okay. And now the Gemara is going to have on Rav Yehuda, not on the Beitzah, on Rav, any small amount of earth, as long as you prior to Yom Tov designated it for any purpose, and yichud like Keren Zavius, it's laying in a way where you can see this is the earth. It's not muktzah. Now I have a problem. And now the Brahma will be from a Mishnah. Guys, we learned this in Chulin. So let's quickly recap. There's behemoths and chayas. Behemoths are three categories: cattle, sheep and goats. That's behemoths. All else is considered halachically chayas, non-domesticated animals. The two huge differences between a behemoth and chaya is, let's go to macholas asurais, the chaylev, the fats, however the Torah defines the fats, not what we call fat. Many of what we call fat is called shuman. But what the Torah defines as chaylev of a behemoth is so prohibited, halachically it's worse than chazer. You're chayv kodes, God forbid. For chazer you get malchus, for this you chayv kodes. Eating chaylev of a behemoth. Chaylev of a chaya you can eat. On the other hand, there is a chumrah by a chaya that when you shecht a chaya and a bird, you have to cover the dam. There is no such obligation when you shecht a behemoth. You go to any shlachtos now, you'll see a lot of blood on the ground because no one is covering anything because they're shechting behemoths. Now, a koi, whether a koi is a buffalo or whether koi is some other creature, in our Mishnah is going to be viewed as an animal that halachically we don't know. We have a suffix whether it's called a behemoth, whether it's called a chaya. And we're not going to be focusing at all on eating its chaylev, which of course you cannot because suffix it's a behemoth. We're going to be viewing now on the covering of the dam. Now when you shecht a koi during the week, you cover the dam. It might be a behemoth, so what? It might be a chaya. What's the downside of covering the dam? We'll see on Amud Beis, there might be a downside, but that's a given. What we said is correct. You cover the blood. What happens on Yom Tov? So, there's the, ultimately, I'll give the heads up, it's tircha sheloi l'tzoyrech. Am I doing something that's not necessary? On the other hand, maybe you're mechuyev. So, can you shecht a koi on Yom Tov? Says the Mishnah, koi ein sheichten oise b'Yom Tov. Don't shechten on Yom Tov. Look inside Rashi. It's mamashir in the mishum the shema chayahu because it might be a chay and v'tzarach kisui for who ein a yachal l'chasoise b'Yom Tov and you can't cover it. Now we're going to have a problem. Like why can't you carry it? Our Mishnah says now of course. Guys, we're learning pshat correctly that if you're going to have to violate a charisha or binyan or katisha, I get it. Then you can't even cover the dam of a chaya vadai. The covering of the dam of our Mishnah is there are times where you have ephod kira, there are times that you have a deker, there are times according to Rav Yehuda you have a little bit of earth. Most people then had some earth in their home. So nevertheless says the Mishnah, don't shecht it, and more than that, ve'im shachatoi ein mechasen as damei. What did Beis Hillel say over here? That's where we began today's shiur. She'im shachat, that if you have earth, which won't be in violation, you should cover it. Now we're going to have to address this. If Rav Yehuda is right, that what? That even a small amount of earth, which was common for people to have, as long as you did not place it down as a new flooring, but you are meyached keren zavius, that means you have a particular spot in which it's piled onto, it's not muktzah. Why lechasiyeh keder Rav Yehuda? So the Gemara says, yeah, that's a kasha Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda was the only scenario where you can cover the dam. The Gemara answers with a kasha. That we just established is okay. Or in our Mishnah, if you have a decker notes, the answer must be elabedalesle. And achanami. The Mishnah must be referring to someone who has no such ashes. You don't have a shovel that was stuck into the ground from before. So our Mishnah, hachinami b'delesle.
Isn't it technically, if you have just a little bit, because you're allowed to have a little bit, you're shechting a big bein, how would it be?
You don't have to cover all the dam. You don't have to cover all of the dam. Oh, so now, hold on. If the Mishnah Chulin, this is a non-answer. If the Mishnah Chulin is speaking about someone who has no afar and no efer, then why do you need to have a case of a koi? What was the whole chiddush of the Gemara in our Mishnah? That even though the Mishnah says over here, Beishami lechatchila, Beis b'di'evet, it's not so simple. It's only when you have the deker, or only if you have efer kina. And now we're adding another thing. If one does not have afilu vaday nameloi, that you can't cover after the fact. You can't cover any times after the fact. So the Gemara says, first of all, the Mishnah in Chulin is the house garnished. And Enachanami, even a vadai. There is a chiddush by telling you can't even shecht a koi. Guys, think about it. People go in the wrong direction. I want to shecht an animal. Simchas Yantiv. What's my problem? I can't do kisui dam. So if I have a chaya vadai, I know that I'm shechting something, and I'm going to be mevatel for sure a mitzvah saseh. But if I'm shechting a koi, first maybe it's a behema, and if it's a behema, I'm not violating anything. So there is a suffix violation versus simchas yantiv. So you would have thought maybe b'diavad you have no other option, you would be allowed to do it. That's pshat in the Mishnah. Loi mi boya kamer, loi mi boya vadai. The case in the Mishnah in Chulin is that you have no option. What the loy lishchoid, but one might have thought avol suffix. Amos say because of simchas yomtiv and lishchoit v'loy lechasye, why would you get away with it? Because a koi is a suffix behema, and if it's a behema, you're not going to be in violation. So you only, so to say, you're only possibly omitting a positive commandment. That's why the Mishnah mentions a koi. But so far we're standing our ground. The Mishnah in Chulin is speaking about someone who does not have, not the bedeker, which is the rarest case. How would you have, you stick a spade into the ground, you don't even have ashes of a oven, which is a chiddush, even though it's not such a big chiddush, because we just clarified that the ashes that you create on Yom Tov, everyone would have ashes on Yom Tov. That's not good. You didn't have ashes from yesterday, and even not, you don't even have a little bit of earth, which was the most common, but a shayach, a person doesn't have it. The Gemara is going to reject this answer. Right, Kamash Mulan is good, turning to Daf Chesam and Beis, nish good. No, doesn't work. Why does it not work? Chavra Hal Kop, it's beautiful. V'hamid diktani seifa. The Mishnah doesn't just say that a koi ein shoichin tin oisoi. So that, you're good. Chiddush, even though you can think it's only a suffix problem, you can't do it. But the Mishnah adds that ve'im shachatoi ein mechasen es damai. So mechlal, that proves from this last line that our Mishnah is speaking about someone who has such an option. And Rashi, beautiful, masel kidvash, words it, koloimer, bish loimam, the opening line, don't shechta koi dereisha, that you can get away with. It's derech kidekada amart. That what? Loi tema nishchait mishum kvoid yantif, beloy kisoi. There's a violation. There might not even be a violation. That makes sense. But why does the Mishnah continue? El lo sefer diktani el ein mechasin. Either lesley. If you don't have any of the three options that we learned until now, guys, what are the three options? You had a spade already stuck on the ground. Yachbar bedeker. Option number 2 is efer kira. Option number 3 is you have a little bit of a basket full of earth. If the Mishnah is you have none of them, my yitzrach la'ashminon. The Mishnah has to tell you that you can't cover it. For sure you can't cover it. Hashta vadei ein mechasin. So suffik mi boyalei. Of course not. No, the problem is muktzah. The problem is worse. You might charisha, you might do binyan. If for a vadai mitzvah, there's a mitzvah. That mitzvah of covering does not justify violating when you only have a suffix. For sure you can't do it. Here the loy boy is in the other direction. There's no need to write it at all. And because of that, Rashi says, Shema Mino, that our Mishnah is speaking about B'de Islay. When a person does have an option, we paskin like Besilil. What does Besilil say? Don't shecht. But if you shecht it, then cover it. So B'de Islay, the legaba vade yes mechasen. So the Mishnah is telling you in the Sefer, but a koinat. Even if Vashmin in the suffix loy. Problem is, coming back to our issue, if b'de islay, why not amai ein machasin? And let's go back to Rav Yehuda. Like Rav Yehuda is just the most common source of offer that you would have in your house, that you don't have to dig out, so there's no charisha, and there's no binyan, and there's no ketisha, and there's no muktzah. Just the most common case. But that's amazing. Rashi doesn't even write Yachbar Bedeker, because Yachbar Bedeker, I think, is the rarest scenario. Who has a spade stuck in the ground with kavanah to take it out? If you didn't put it in there to take out earth, it's not called mukhan. In other words, sometimes you don't have where to put a shovel, you just stick it into the ground. That doesn't resolve muktzah. Muktzah means you stuck it into the ground just in case you'll need earth. That earth is already designated to be used. So Rashi doesn't mention it. So we're back to the question. So approach number 2. Guys, on Daf Chesam at base, 3rd line from the top. Ella Omar either Rabba or the Messiah Sasha says Rava, that, look at this. The case of the Mishnah is there are ashes in the oven that you had from before Yom Tov. So didn't we say ashes is considered prepared? not for everything. Ela amar Rava efer kira muchen levadai ve'ein muchen lesafik. The initial understanding of Rava is that even if someone said explicitly, guys, this ashes, I'm going to use for whatever I need on Yom Tov. People used everything then. There was no disposables. These ashes, even if he said, I'll use it for anything that I need, doesn't help for it to be used for something that might not need to be covered. Designation, and again, the Havamina is, even if you said to be machasa, to be machasa v'koi, that's the Havamina. The Gemara is going to refute that. It doesn't work for a suffix. So the Gemara says, hold on. L'safik my tamaloi. Why can't you use it? If the issue is because you're making a guma, we never mentioned this until now, the Gemara just wants to be marames, that just like binyan, you might think is in the earth, maybe there's a binyan in the ashes. If there would be such a scenario, because there is a solid, ashes are hardened, sahart, and you're making a hole, then vadei namika avid guma. Ella, the answer will be kedrab abba, that even if you make a guma, it's a non-problem. Why not chevre? Malach shein tzricha legufa, or according to Rashi, kilkul. Malach shein tzricha legufa is patalav alasir, but simchas yamtiv hachinami kedrab abba. Ella safik my tama dilma avet ketisha. Let's go back. You might end up. Let's say there will be a little bit of a klad. There'll be a little bit of a very hard piece. So you'll grind it. So vadeinama nigzar mishum ketisha. Why is suffix different? It's muchan. The designation should remove it from muktzah, and all the other issues are automatically resolved. So the Gemara says, here's the issue: that it's not muktzah. What Rava meant is that never use ash. Really, never even use deker that we learned in the Mishnah for a suffix, because we are afraid that maybe if when you bring up the earth it won't be loose, if when you bring up the ashes there'll be a clod in it, you might end up grinding it. You might end up, now the question is, by vadai oichet, you might end up grinding it. That will be the naki here. That having a fear that you might violate is only problematic by a suffix and not problematic for a vadai. Because of asay doichaloisase, as we'll see in a moment. I vadai namay nigzar mishum ketisha. Let us be afraid that you might do it. So it says the Gemara vadai. First of all, when you know you're going to do it, we don't allow you to do it. Make that clear. Offer tichoyach. The earth is loose. Ashes generally are very ashy. There might be a scenario by a vadai, it won't be the end of the world. Why will it not be the end of the world? Because of the rule of asay doicha loisasem. What's the esse? Kisui dam ba'ofar. What's the love? Not loisasem melacha. So since grinding it, crushing it, is in fulfillment of the asay, so even if it's going to happen, esse doicha loisasem. There are many questions you can have in it. The biggest question, which the Gemara is going to speak out, is, I'll speak it out right now. You know when we say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, there are two sources from that. We're going to learn this in the beginning of Yavamas. That's the big topic. Number one is by a bris milah. If a person has a halachic sign of tzaras on their body, then they're not allowed to cut it off. Solution: I have a tzaras, cut it off. The Torah says don't cut it off. One of the reasons why the Torah repeats again on the 8th day, cut to make a bris milah, is that if there is such a sign on the foreskin that should be cut off, there is a sign of leprosy, you cut it off. You're not allowed to cut off a sign of leprosy. Positive commandment, cut off. The other classical case is when it comes to wearing shatnez. And if a person has a linen garment, even though midarabanan we don't put tzitzis on a linen garment, but midoiraisa, if you have a linen garment and there is a mitzvah to put on it tzitzis. Now today, some people are already wearing tchelis. I want you to know that tchelis is only valid if it's dyed on wool. So tchelis on a linen garment will be a shatnez. You are allowed to wear it. That coffee is cold. The coffee over there is good. Shatnez. You are allowed to wear tchelis on a linen garment. Why? In both of these cases, at the moment that you are fulfilling the negative, you are violating the negative, at that moment you're doing the positive, which is why it's justified. It's while you're cutting off the tzoras, that act is the fulfillment. That's called be'idne at the same time. While you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis, you're taka violating shatnez, but you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis. When are you fulfilling the mitzvah of covering the blood? When you cover the blood. Crushing is something that normally is done prior to make sure that it's not a clod, that it's fabrekel, that it's turned into granules, if that's the right way of pronouncing it. So the Gemara says, that if vadai, then ki avid ketisha asa sevidah chaloisase. You get the logic. When you have a koi, that explains the koi. Since there is a suffix whether there is a mitzvah asay, so there isn't a asay doy chaloisase. There's a suffix asay. A suffix asay doesn't override the loisase. Says the Gemara, that doesn't work because like we said, that's when you have mila bitzoras, that you are allowed to and you are actually obligated to cut off the foreskin. Inami or sudden bitzitzis. Sudden refers to a linen garment. Tzitzis means the tchelis part because the other strands don't have to be wool. Actually, it's ideal, a side of wool and linen, even if we're not going to follow the Rambam that holds that tzitzis only has to be put biblically on a garment of wool and linen, let's not follow the Rambam. If you wear cotton, right, so then you want to put strands, either wool or linen or cotton. Normally the strands should match the beged. The exception is, tchelis has to be made out of wool. Has to be made out of wool. The be'idna the kama akir lav, because at the moment that one is violating the negative commandment, then kam moikim la'aseh. But how can you b'chlal bring in the topic of esadoy chaloisase? Here, when it comes to covering the dam, hacha be'idna the kama akir, while you're doing ketisha, or which is really, let's say, tchina, at that moment you're not fulfilling the positive commandment. The positive commandment is to cover it.
This kasha is even on a vadai.
This kasha is even on a vadai. Correct. So therefore, Shleima, you can't say that we don't make a gzeira on the vadai because of esadoy chaloisase. Why would we make a gzeira? Even if you do it, it's not a problem. It's not true. Now, one second. Charisha, everyone knew right away. Charisha is taka done before. It was never brought up. Binyan is zikr done before when you take it out. You're moving it before. The esadoy chaloisase only touches ketisha. That's why we said we have a ferkira, we have deker, we have Rav Yehuda's earth. Problem is there might be a clod. So here that was the chab, that's the initial, that was the second approach. The difference is that for a vadai esadoy chaloisase and for a suffix, you don't know whether you're obligated. So therefore there might not be an asay. How is it shaykh esadoy chaloisase? The Gemara says it's shaykh. You know why? Holoi kasha, that's not a problem. Because when will you crush the clod? Not the blood is in front of you. You're not going to crush it in your hand now and then cover the blood. You're going to bring this clod on top of the blood and you're going to crush it while it's being placed on the top. There could be a be'idna. You could do it at the same time. By the way, now all other questions are answered. Like many people ask, like why is it only a gzeira? Why don't we lechatchila care if there's a cloud of earth? Why do you have to have, let's say, ofar tichoyach, say esadoy chaloisase? The answer is no, because you might end up crushing it prior to putting it on top. Then you don't have an esadoy chaloisase. You have to have earth that's very broken down already. That's very fluffy, that's very loose. You can ask, make a gzeira, you might end up finding a cloud of earth. For that, the answer is, we don't make a gzeira. Because even if there's a cloud of earth, it's possible for you to do a beheter, which is be'idna, doing it on top of the blood, gemaldik, so you can't make a gzeira. But by a suffix, by a koi, that's the Mishnah and Chulin, there's no essa because maybe it is a behema. The Gemara says, it sounds good, all of this will be rejected. Why will all of this be rejected? Because Yom Tov isn't only a lav. The Torah doesn't only say, thou shalt not work on Yom Tov. there's a mitzvah of resting on Yom Tov. Yom Tov itself is an esse and a loisase. Esse doiche loisase. Ve'ein esse doiche loisase ve'esse. Fragt die Gemara, soif, Yom Tov is an asay and a loisase. It's a positive commandment and a negative commandment. And this rule that a positive overrides a negative doesn't apply to double. Ve'ein esse doiche es loisase ve'esse. Okay, so Elo Amar Rabba. Now, if before the Girsa was Rabba, that works. So Rabba, the teacher, was refuted. Elo Amar Rabba, a new answer. Even if it was Rava, say that Rabba has to clarify. And in the first step of Rava, 3 lines from the top, Rashi writes, the understanding was that even when someone designates ashes for covering a suffix, it's not going to help. It's not going to help. So therefore, you have to use earth. You have to use earth, and by earth there's a gzeira, that there might be a klad, and that gzeira is made for a suffix. No. Rava said something else. If you have ashes that were explicitly designated to use to cover a koi, you could use it. Let me go back. By ashes, there won't be a klad. The whole klad is by the earth. The case of the reason why the Mishnah in Chulin has a problem with the koi is because earth cannot be used, we explained, because there's a problem with earth. You have a ferkira by default is only designated for a vadai and not for a suffix. If a person before Yom Tov said, I'm going to use the ashes that is in my oven to cover the blood of a koi, according to the answer right now, you can shech the koi. According to the answer right now. But normally, it's designated stam. Stam designation is to use, a designation of ashes is for that which needs a covering, or for any other certain need. When you have ashes in your oven, and you know, I might need ashes, we'll give examples. Why would you need ashes for? Same thing goes with earth. Why would a person need earth for?
Food.
So he's saying it a four you can't do on Yom Tov. People would use ashes. It was very common before the generation of diapers, but people who have young kids. Can you imagine your home with diapers with young kids? There was freilach. There was feces on the ground, and one of the purposes that people would use earth would be to cover that. And we're going to learn about when something is designated. Is it designated only for certain needs? Is it also designated for possible needs? That's the issue here. So since it's a suffix, whether it's a need or not, Efer is designated for vadai. It's not designated for suffix unless explicitly designated for suffix. Then you're okay. And here's the great example. You brought into your house earth, and your intent was to cover a child feces if the need will arise. Now, covering tsoya, according to Rava, is a suffix. It won't always happen. Then certainly you can cover dam tzipor. You shech the tzipor and you cover it. Why? Because you have offer that's muchan to be used. If you designated it for a possible usage, it's automatically designated for a certain usage. But what about on the opposite? This is beautiful. Dam tzipor. If a person brought before Yom Tov offer in his home, and why? I want to shech the bird on Yom Tov. I have a chicken. I got my offer. You can use it for the offer. There's nothing to talk about. Yet says Rava Asr Lachasas by Tsoya. Can't be used to cover tsoya. Why? Because the need of covering tsoya is not a certain need. Before Yom Tov, it's a possible need. So he holds Beshita that it's not that is it muktzah or is it not muktzah? Is it designated or is it not designated? Rava subscribes to a concept that you designate it for those things that there is a certainty that you'll need it for. It's muchan only for that. It's not automatically muchan for a suffix. Now, if you said explicitly, like by the tsoya, I'm bringing the offer for the tsoya, then if there is a need, you can use it. If you would bring the offer to cover dam koi, according to this answer, since you were clear that you're going to use it, then you can use it according to this answer. We're not focusing on tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech, we're just focusing on muktzah. But since you brought an offer, you have Efer Kira. Efer Kira is designated stam only for a vadai, not for a suffix. And just to know, speaking about this topic of if you brought earth in to cover tsoya, if you brought earth to cover a dam tzipor, that the chevre in the har beloi hold, the har beloi omrei, that afilu hichnes offer lachasas by tzipor, they held muter lachasas by tsoya. Why? Because they held that the probability, they had more kinderlach, or their kinderlach were busier. The probability of the need of covering feces of a child is so likely, it's considered a vadai. Amri b'marava, a similar machlok. Yes.
Don't we normally say on Yom Tov that once, I don't know if it's out fire or like food, or like something's butter, once it's butter, it's butter. So like if you make fire for cooking, you could also make it for eating.
We don't say that by muktzah. You're speaking about the class of a malacha, like hoil, that you are allowed to do. Let's say you're carrying l'tzoyrach oichel nefesh hutra nami shelo. You carry your machzer to the shul. Correct. But here we're not speaking about doing a av malacha. We're speaking about muktzah, and we're speaking about muchan. And when you prepare something, if it was clearly only prepared for A and not for B, you can never use it for B. That's clear. We don't say that. Okay, weiter. Omri b'marav that pligeba Rab Yosi bar Chama v'Rab Zera. Or v'amri la, there are others that hold that the disputants of the following, which is like the above, second line, was between Rav Bereda Rab Yosi bar Chama and Rab Zera. Tzvika, let's go. Chad Amar. Mamish concerning this, that could you use earth that was designated for a vadai purpose? Could you use it to cover the kvi? He holds that kvi hareyu ketsoya. We view kvi like a tsoya. In other words, that earth that's prepared for one use could be used for another usage. They hold that earth that was prepared for dam tzipor could be used to cover. If earth was used to cover tsoya, it could be used to cover a kvi. To cover a kvi, it can be used to cover earth. V'chad amar kvi eino ketsoya. They actually held like the nehar beloi that considers covering feces is considered a definite need or very likely need, and something that was designated to cover tsoya could be used for the kvi. Kvi l'kula alma, my friends, and they held that no, only for tsoya yes, and for kvi not. Okay, and now you want to know from these two opinions which one said what. Testayim the Rava hu the Amar kfi hareu ketsoya, and the proof is the Amar Rava hichnes offer lachasas by tsoya muter lachasas by dam tzipor also lachasas by tsoya. Indeed, testayim. So gavaldik. So that was the third approach that the Mishnah in Chulin is speaking about someone that has efer kira. And therefore, the Mishnah is only speaking about a kvi or a koi, because if you shech the bird, you can use efer kira. So why can't you use it for a kvi? Just because something is not muksa to cover dam tzipor, it is muksa if you are using it for something that might not even need its usage. Mamash like this concept that if you designate it offer to cover dam tzipor, you cannot use it to cover tsoya. Now, another approach, Rami Bereid Rav Yeva Amar. The reason why the Mishnah in Chulin says that a koi may not be slaughtered, koi hainu tamid olay mechasinon, even after the fact, a whole new reason. You know what that is? If someone is going to see you covering the dam of a koi, you know what they're going to think? They're going to think, you're doing it on Yom Tiv? The Chachamim decided that a koi is a chaya. And what's the problem for you thinking the koi is a chaya? Someone is going to eat a chaylev. And if it's a behema, chaylev is also b'karis, and now that there's a suffix, it's a suffix karis. Gezeira mishum hataras chelboi. Fregt die Gemara, yach afila b'chol nami. Then you should never be allowed to cover dam of the koi. No, if someone sees you covering the dam, they're going to say, it's only lenaker chatzera yotzarach. You're only cleaning out your courtyard. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? What happens if you shecht the koi in a place where no one cares if it's dirty? For example, shachad ba'ashpa. You shecht it on top of a trash heap. What, are you going to tell me that you're not allowed to cover the dam? Because gezeira people will think that they paskin dvadai. Everyone knows that a koi is a suffix. Ma'ikela meimar. Or another question, what happens if someone is coming to ask Rav a question? Do I have to cover the dam? Not cleaning. And the Rav is going to say, yes. So aren't we afraid that we should be afraid? Oh, yeah? Chaya, you're going to eat the chayla? Ma'ikala meimar? Ella, the Gemara clarifies. B'choil, a person knows that koy is a doubt. You know why a person is covering it? The fresh state. Because Amri leid Abanon, whenever there's a doubt, it's normal for the Chachamim to say, Zil, go, trach, make the effort and cover it. But biyamtiv, if it would only be a doubt, which it is, if it's not vadechaya, which it's not, will they tell you to cover it? They would not tell you to cover it. Why? Because on Yom Tiv, we are not allowed to engage in a tircha, which is shaloi l'tzoyrech. Any excessive exertion that's not needed, that's why it's called excessive, is something that one may not do on Yom Tiv. So because of tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech, even after the fact, you're not allowed to cover the dam. Says the Gemara Tani, Rabbi Zeira, that loy koibel vad amru, that you may not cover its dam on Yom Tiv. Another similar concept of tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech, chavra halkab, afilu shachad be'em chayv oif, you shechted all three, and the bloods are mixed together. V'nesar v'dam zabuzeh, asur l'chasoyse b'Yom Tiv. You're not allowed to cover all of its bloods. Why not? Because some of your tircha is to cover the behema, or it's all mixed together. There's no need to cover dam behema. So your effort, which also, or the added effort to cover dam behema is not allowed. You know what you do? Cover nothing. Wow. Now tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech is a rabbinic issue, and that will be a classical case that yesh koyach b'yat chachamim la'akar davar min ha'torah, because there is a mitzvahs asay to cover the dam. Don't do it if you have to do tircha yitzera. Amir Rabbi Yosi bar Yasiniya, that lo yishanu, that if you have a mixture of dam behema and dam chay and dam tzipor, that you may not cover it, any of it on Yom Tiv, elo she'ein yochel chasoisi b'dikira achas, that with one throw of earth, you can't cover all of it. So you're making another thrust also for the dam behema. That's where you got a problem. But if there's so little blood, that all you need to do is to throw one shovelful. If there would have been dam chaya, one shovelful. Now that you have dam behema, one shovelful. You're not adding anything. I don't care that it's also covering the dam behema. You did not do any extra work. Then mutter. Okay. The Gemara says pshita. Who even needed to say that? No, we need to say that because one would have thought, "Mao the tema nigzar dekira achas atu shtei dekira is make exera kamash malan," that such a decree is not made. Beautiful. Now we concluded the explanation of our Mishnah. We explained what's unique about the koi, and now we are moving on. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba, or here we have the Rosh brings Amar Rav, Shachat Sipur me'erev Yontav. This is amazing. You shechted a bird out of Yontiv and you did not yet cover the dam. Ein mechasen oise b'Yontiv. Look inside the last line of Rashi. Since the hoyloi lechases mi ba'od yoim, so don't cover the dam. Now hold on. What's the whole topic that we learned here? That Beis Hillel says cover the dam, and let's appreciate what we learned. What's the issue? What's the issue is why not lechatchila? That's the conclusion of our sugya. Why not lechatchila? Because you might have a klad in the earth, and you might end up crushing it. Now, even though there is a way to do it beheted, there isn't. There is no way because esaloi doicha. We are afraid of a cloud of earth. So even though you have loose earth, don't do it lechatchila. So why does Beis Hillel allow b'di'evet? He allows to do it b'di'evet because of Simchas Yontiv. So if you don't have meat, that's why you can do the whole thing. But now that you shechted in b'boid yoim, and you should have already covered it then, so what would be the only reason that you would be allowed to do it? One might have thought that until you covered the blood, you can't eat the meat. If that would have been the case, then when you have deker, when you have efer kira, if you have the earth of Rav Yehuda, then you would be allowed to do it. The point is that you don't need to do it. And again, it's all a fear that you might end up crushing the earth. Verstehst? So, just because you didn't cover the blood, it's not essential to be matir the meat. In other words, guys, kisui dam, is it the ending of the shechita? Is it an extension of the shechita, which, by the way, are the words of Rashi in the last daf? We didn't read it out. Or is it a separate mitzvah? If it would be mamish, an extension of the shechita, then one might have thought that until you do the kisui dam, the shechita is not over yet. The shechita is the matir. But it is separate mitzvahs. You know what the biggest proof is? We paskin at separate mitzvahs. We know this from kaparas. Even though that normally the shoichet does the mitzvah of kisui dam ba'afar, but it doesn't happen that way by kaparas. The shoichet shechts, the shoichet makes the bracha on the shechita, and I make the bracha on the kisui dam ba'afar. It's two separate brachas, it's two separate mitzvahs. Melicha is for sure not a hemshech, because melicha is about taking out the dam. And you can eat it before melicha, like we learned. If you cut a raw piece of meat out of the neck, if dam is in the place, if it's still in the place where it was, then you just wash off the top. Now, the top test. Now, however, so if the bird was slaughtered before Yom Tov, and even though there's a mitzvah saseh to cover it, as we see clearly, without the Simchas Yom Tov step, there are fears. Something might go wrong. You might break. Don't do anything. So you already have the meat. Don't do it. But Gilgel Isa, if a person needed a dough from before Yom Tov without separating challah, here mafresh memenu chalasa b'Yom Tov, you are allowed to separate challah. Now, then it just mentioned the tzoyrech oichel nefesh, food-related matters. We learned the Tosfos from Lisha ve'elach. You're allowed to do on Yom Tov. You're allowed to do on Yom Tov. Needing a dough you can do on Yom Tov. What about separating challah? Well, don't forget that there is a rabbinic prohibition of separating trumas and maasros. It's called mesakin. It's connected to makeh b'patish. If I'm making the dough on Yom Tov, for sure I can separate challah. That's the only way I can have fresh challah on Yom Tov. Here, the person didn't make the dough on Yom Tov. He made it erev Yom Tov. He should have separated challah before Yom Tov. So that's the question. Do we say that the Chachamim never made a problem with separating challah, or they did? So here, whether it's Rav or Rabbi hold, they did. If you made the dough on Yom Tov, you can separate challah. You had no other option. Here you made it from before Yom Tov. You should have done it yesterday. You're not allowed to do it. Right, the opposite. Rav is lenient. Rav is the lenient one that says that since you are allowed to separate challah if you need a dough on Yom Tov, it means that the Chachamim excluded from challah their iser derabanan. You can separate challah, but Avua de Shmuel Amar, the father of Shmuel, says afilu gilgalisa me'erev Yom Tov, even though you did it before Yom Tov, or when you did it before Yom Tov, ein mafresh mimenu chalasa b'Yom Tov. They only excluded the problem of separating challah if you made the dough on Yom Tov, not before. Now the Gemara says, you know what? We'll stop over here. So we ended up, if you shechted a bird before Yom Tov, l'kula ama, you cannot cover the blood. If you made a dough before Yom Tov and you were not yet mafresh challah, so Rav or Rabba says you are allowed to do it, and the father of Shmuel, Abba bar Abba, holds that you are a mafresh. You're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do it, and so we paskin.
Can you eat it after you don't do it?
If you're not, we'll see in a moment, can you eat it if you're not mafresh challah, if it's challah midrabanan? We'll see in a moment. We're going to learn that if it's only challah midrabanan, you can eat and leave over. We'll see that, we'll continue tomorrow.